The most dangerous men don't raise their voices. They lower the temperature of the room. I remember the exact second the church went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that makes people forget how to breathe. Father Graham had just reached the middle of the vows when the heavy wooden doors opened behind us. No one turned at first. They didn't have to. You could feel him enter. The air changed. Even the candle flames along the marble walls looked smaller somehow. My fingers tightened around the bouquet as slow footsteps echoed across the floor. One pair. Measured. Calm. Expensive Italian leather against old church stone. My fiancé, Daniel, stopped speaking mid-sentence. That was the first thing that scared me. Daniel Carter loved hearing himself talk. But now his jaw was locked so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Then I heard whispers. Tiny ones, like people praying under their breath. Moretti. Vincent Moretti. I didn't turn around immediately. I should have. Maybe everything would have changed if I had. But fear is strange. Sometimes your body knows something terrible before your mind accepts it. The organ music had already stopped. Every guest sat frozen beneath the stained glass windows, staring toward the aisle behind me. I finally looked over my shoulder. And there he was. Vincent Moretti wore a black suit with no tie, like he hadn't come for a wedding. He looked tall enough to block the light coming through the entrance behind him. Calm gray eyes, dark hair brushed back. No visible anger. That was the terrifying part. Men like him didn't need to shout. He walked forward slowly while 6-foot bodyguards remained near the doors, refusing to step inside the sanctuary. Even they understood boundaries in a church. Vincent didn't look at Daniel. He didn't look at the guests. He looked only at me. And somehow that felt worse. I had seen powerful men before. Politicians. Investors. Men who shook hands too hard and smiled too wide. But Vincent Moretti carried power differently. Like it exhausted him. Like the world belonged to him, and he no longer cared enough to prove it. He stopped inches away from me. Close enough for me to catch the faint scent of cedar and cold rain on his coat. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then his eyes lowered to my wedding dress. Slowly, Vincent lifted one hand. The church collectively held its breath. His fingers brushed the fabric near my waist so lightly it barely counted as touch. But the reaction around us was immediate. One woman gasped. Someone dropped a champagne glass near the back pews. Father Graham forgot the next line of scripture entirely. Because every person in that church knew one thing about Vincent Moretti. He never touched anything he didn't already consider his. Daniel stepped forward fast. "Don't!" he snapped, voice shaking more than he wanted. Vincent ignored him completely. His fingertips stayed against the silk for one long second before his expression changed. Not anger. Worse. Recognition. I felt it immediately. The shift in his breathing. The sharp stillness in his eyes. Vincent looked down at the stitching hidden beneath the outer layer of the dress. Almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Then he said 5 words that turned my wedding into something else entirely. "Where did you get this?" People think fear is loud. It is not. Fear sounds like polished shoes stopping at the exact same time across an entire church. Nobody moved after Vincent asked his question. Even the air conditioning hummed softer somehow. I could still feel the warmth of his hand through the layers of silk wrapped around my waist. It should not have mattered. It was only fabric. But the second he touched my dress, something invisible shifted inside the room. Daniel recovered first. Barely. "Security," he said sharply. Although his voice cracked on the last word. None of the security men moved. That was when I realized something important. They were not Daniel's men anymore. They were Vincent's audience. Vincent kept his eyes on the stitching hidden beneath the lace. Tiny silver thread shaped into a symbol no bigger than a quarter. I had seen it before while fitting the dress 2 weeks earlier. The designer called it vintage detailing. Said it came from an old European collection. I never questioned it. Now I wished I had. "Vincent," Father Graham said carefully, like speaking to a wounded animal, "this is not the place." Vincent finally looked up. Calm. Controlled. "You are right, Father." His voice was low and smooth, carrying effortlessly through the church without ever becoming loud. But apparently my family history is. Murmurs spread instantly through the guests. My father's face had gone completely pale near the front pew. I stared at him. He would not meet my eyes. My stomach tightened. "Dad?" I whispered. "Nothing." He adjusted his cufflinks with trembling fingers. That frightened me more than Vincent's arrival. My father never trembled. Vincent noticed too. Of course he did. Men like him noticed weakness the way sharks noticed blood in water. But there was something else in his expression. Not satisfaction. Disappointment. Like he had hoped he was wrong. Daniel stepped beside me, placing one hand on my back for appearance more than comfort. "This wedding is over," he said toward Vincent. "You made your point." Vincent slowly turned his head toward him for the first time since entering the church. The entire room stiffened. But Vincent only asked one question. "Do you even know why she is marrying you?" Daniel's jaw hardened instantly. "Careful." Vincent almost smiled at that. Almost. "That is not an answer." I felt heat rising beneath my skin. "Stop talking about me like I am not standing here." Both men looked at me immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than the organ music from earlier. Vincent's eyes softened for half a second. Just enough for me to notice. "You are right," he said quietly. "You deserve the truth before everyone else does." My father stood abruptly. "That is enough." The sharpness in his voice startled several guests. Vincent glanced toward him without emotion. "You had 3 years to tell her yourself." 3 years. The words hit me strangely. Too specific. Too personal. I stared at Vincent again, trying desperately to understand why he looked at me like someone remembering a song they never forgot. Then it happened. A memory. Rain hitting pavement. Cold wind. A black sedan parked crooked beside a curb downtown. A man leaning against the passenger door with blood running down his sleeve while refusing help from everyone except me. My breathing stopped. No, impossible. That night had happened 3 years ago during a storm outside St. Jude Hospital. I had given a stranger my coat while waiting for a cab. He never told me his name, but I remembered his eyes. Gray, calm, exhausted, exactly like the man standing in front of me now. Vincent saw recognition spread across my face, and somehow that seemed to hurt him more than anger would have. He looked down briefly before speaking in a voice so quiet only the front rows could hear. "You were not supposed to remember me. Some memories do not come back gently. They return like lightning through closed eyes." The moment Vincent spoke, the church disappeared around me. I was back in Manhattan 3 years earlier, standing beneath the flickering awning outside St. Jude Hospital while freezing rain soaked through my shoes. It had been just after midnight. December, the kind of New York cold that made every breath feel expensive. I remembered hugging my coat tighter while trying to flag down a cab that never came. Then I saw him across the street. A man leaning against a black sedan with one hand pressed against his side, shoulders tense beneath the rain. At first I thought he was drunk. Wealthy men in Manhattan were drunk all the time. But something about him felt different. He looked too controlled, too aware. Even exhausted, he carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Cars passed without stopping. People noticed him and immediately looked away. That part haunted me later. Everyone saw him. Nobody helped him. I almost kept walking too. But then he looked up. Gray eyes. Steady. Calm despite the storm pouring down his face. Not asking for help. Somehow that made it worse. "Sir." I remembered calling out carefully from the curb. "Are you okay?" He stared at me for a second like he was trying to understand why I was speaking to him at all. Then his gaze shifted toward my hospital volunteer badge hanging from my coat pocket. "You should go home," he said quietly. Even back then, his voice carried authority without effort. I should have listened. Instead, I crossed the street. Rainwater splashed around my ankles while traffic lights reflected red and gold across the pavement. When I got close enough, I noticed his sleeve was stained dark from the weather. His breathing looked shallow, controlled, like he refused to let himself appear weak. "You need a doctor," I told him. He almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. No hospitals, he answered immediately. The response came too fast, like fear hidden beneath discipline. I remember studying his face under the streetlights. Early 30s maybe, sharp features, expensive watch, wedding ring absent. There was something lonely about him that night. Not physically alone, spiritually alone. Like the entire city had decided he was untouchable long before I arrived. Then at least sit down before you pass out, I said. I am not going to pass out. That sounds exactly like someone about to pass out. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Barely. But I noticed. I took off my wool coat and handed it to him before he could refuse. You are freezing, I said. And honestly, you look terrible. His eyes lowered to the coat in silence. Nobody had ever looked more confused by kindness. You do not know who I am, he finally said. No, I answered. But you still look like you need help. The rain softened around us. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed through downtown traffic. He stared at me for a long moment that felt strangely personal despite us being strangers. Then he accepted the coat carefully, almost respectfully, like it was something fragile. Eveline, he read softly from my volunteer badge. Hearing my name in his voice made my heartbeat stumble for reasons I could not explain. You should not stop for men like me. I remember smiling despite the cold. Maybe men like you should stop giving people reasons to walk away. For a second, his expression changed completely. Not powerful. Not dangerous. Just tired. Human. Then headlights appeared at the corner. 2 black SUVs turned onto the street fast enough to spray water across the sidewalk. The second they stopped, several men rushed toward us wearing dark coats and expressions filled. With panic, they were trying hard to hide. One of them froze when he saw me standing beside Vincent. Sir, he said carefully. Vincent handed my coat back before the others reached us. His fingers brushed mine for half a second. Cold skin, steady hands, unforgettable eyes. Thank you, Eveline, he said quietly. Then he disappeared into the SUVs without another word. I stood there in the rain for almost 10 minutes afterward, wondering why a stranger felt impossible to forget. There are people you forget before the elevator doors close. And then there are people who stay in your mind like unfinished sentences. I did not see Vincent Moretti again after that rainy night outside St. Jude Hospital. At least not officially. But after remembering his face inside the church, pieces of the last 3 years began sliding together in ways that made my chest tighten. Tiny moments, strange moments, things that never made sense until now. My father's company should have collapsed 18 months ago. Everyone knew it. Carter Holdings had been drowning in debt quietly for years while pretending otherwise at charity galas and country club dinners. I remembered overhearing arguments through office doors. Banks pulling out. Investors disappearing. My father sitting alone at the dining table long after midnight with both hands covering his face. Then suddenly everything changed. Contracts appeared from nowhere. Financial pressure vanished almost overnight. Reporters started calling my father resilient. Daniel entered our lives around the same time. Clean-cut, educated, future mayoral candidate with polished smiles and perfect suits. He spoke like a campaign speech even during dinner. My mother adored him instantly. My father practically worshipped him. I tried to convince myself I loved him too. That was the problem with loneliness. Sometimes gratitude disguises itself as love until it is too late. Looking back now, I realized something else. Every time life cornered me, something invisible pulled me back out again. When my apartment building had an electrical fire last winter, a luxury condo became available 2 days later at half the market price. When a drunk driver nearly hit me crossing Lexington Avenue, a black SUV appeared out of nowhere and blocked the intersection before impact. At the time, I thought it was coincidence. Standing in that church now, I understood coincidence had gray eyes. Vincent stepped back from me slowly, giving me space even while the entire room remained terrified of him. That detail mattered more than people understood. Powerful men usually moved closer when they wanted control. Vincent moved away, like he was afraid proximity itself might ruin something. You knew her? Daniel asked sharply. The jealousy in his voice sounded uglier than anger. Vincent ignored him again. 3 years, he said quietly while looking at me. And you still stop for strangers. I swallowed hard. You remembered my name. His expression barely changed, but I felt the answer before he spoke. Some things are expensive to forget. The guests exchanged nervous glances. Nobody understood the conversation except us, and somehow that made everything more intimate than romance ever could. My father suddenly stood from the pew and walked toward us faster than I had seen him move in years. Eveline, he said tightly, come stand beside Daniel. I looked at him carefully. Sweat lined his forehead despite the cold church air. Why are you scared of him? I asked. I am not scared. Vincent finally looked toward my father fully. The silence afterward felt brutal. That is the first honest thing you have said today, Vincent replied. Father Graham stepped between them carefully. Gentlemen, this can still be handled privately. Privately, Vincent repeated softly. He stitched my mother's crest into her wedding dress. Every eye in the church dropped to the silver embroidery near my waist. My breathing became shallow. Your mother, I whispered. Vincent nodded once. No performance. No dramatics. Just truth heavy enough to change the room. She wore that symbol the night she died. Daniel looked confused now rather than angry. What does any of this have to do with Eveline? Vincent answered without hesitation. That is exactly what I came here to find out. My pulse started pounding harder beneath the corset of the dress. Because for the first time all morning, Vincent Moretti did not look dangerous. He looked betrayed. And somehow that frightened me more. The strange thing about truth is that your body recognizes it before your mind does. I knew my father was hiding something long before he opened his mouth. It was in the way he avoided looking at Vincent directly. The way his hands shook slightly every time the silence lasted too long. My father had spent his entire life building the image of a composed businessman. But standing in front of Vincent Moretti, he looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy to keep hiding. This is not the place, he finally said, voice rougher now. Then tell her somewhere else, Vincent replied calmly. Because she deserves better than half the truth on her wedding day. Daniel stepped closer beside me again, jaw tight with frustration. You are manipulating this entire situation. Vincent turned toward him slowly. If I wanted to manipulate the situation, Councilman Carter, this church would already be empty. The room became even quieter somehow. Daniel looked away first. That detail did not escape anyone. I stared at the silver stitching near my waist again. Such a small symbol. Tiny threads hidden beneath lace and satin. Yet somehow powerful enough to stop a wedding in the middle of the vows. Dad, I asked carefully, how did this crest end up on my dress? My father swallowed hard. It was not supposed to. Vincent's expression darkened slightly. Not rage. Hurt. Controlled hurt. Interesting answer. Father Graham stepped forward carefully again. Perhaps everyone should take a moment to breathe. I have spent 20 years breathing around lies, Vincent said quietly. I am no longer interested in patience. His words settled heavily across the pews. Some guests lowered their eyes immediately. Others stared at Vincent like he was something dangerous trapped behind glass. But I could not stop watching him for a different reason. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, like this confrontation had cost him more than anyone realized. My mother suddenly stood from the second row with tears already gathering in her eyes. Eveline, she whispered, please come here. I looked between my parents slowly. No, the single word shocked even me. My mother's face fell instantly, but I was tired of being moved around like furniture inside my own life. Nobody is leaving until somebody tells me the truth. Vincent glanced at me briefly, then looked away again, almost like restraint required effort. 3 years ago, my father began carefully. Our company was collapsing. Daniel stiffened beside me. Apparently even he had not known everything. We owed money everywhere. my father continued. Banks refused to help us. Investors disappeared. We were finished. And then, I asked. My father closed his eyes briefly before answering. Vincent Moretti bought the debt. My breathing stopped for half a second. I looked toward Vincent immediately. He did not deny it. Why? I asked him. Because your father once knew my family, Vincent answered quietly. And because I owed your mother respect she never received. My confusion deepened instantly. What does that even mean? Vincent hesitated. That alone surprised me. Men like him usually spoke with absolute certainty. But now he looked careful with every word around me. My mother trusted your father many years ago, he finally said. That trust destroyed her life. My father lowered his head. The shame on his face answered more than words could. Daniel let out a frustrated breath. This still does not explain Eveline. Vincent's eyes shifted toward me again. Steady. Unreadable. No, he said softly. It explains why I stayed away from her. The church fell silent all over again. Because everyone heard the implication beneath those words. He knew who I was long before today. My pulse quickened. You knew about me? Vincent nodded once. After St. Jude Hospital, I had your name removed from every report connected to that night. What reports? The kind that follow men like me. Something cold moved through my chest. Not fear exactly. Realization. You have been watching me? For the first time since entering the church, Vincent looked almost guilty. Only enough to make sure the world did not punish you for helping a stranger. My heart beat harder against the corset of the dress, because suddenly every coincidence over the last 3 years no longer felt random. And the most terrifying part was not that Vincent Moretti had quietly protected my life. It was the fact that he never once asked for anything in return. The hardest part about betrayal is realizing love was standing in the same room the entire time pretending not to see it. Nobody in the church spoke after Vincent admitted he had been protecting me. Even Daniel looked unsettled now, though he tried hard to hide it behind political composure. The image of him had always been polished, confident, safe. But standing beside Vincent Moretti felt like standing beside a cardboard cutout during a thunderstorm. One man looked practiced, the other looked real, and that terrified me. You had no right, Daniel finally said sharply. Vincent looked toward him with complete calm. To keep her safe? To involve yourself in her life. Vincent's eyes shifted back to me before he answered. I never involved myself in her life. The quiet honesty in his voice made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Because he was right. He had never appeared at my door. Never called me. Never demanded gratitude. Everything he had done happened invisibly. Like protection without ownership. My father suddenly sat down heavily in the front pew as if his legs could no longer support him. My mother reached for his arm immediately. Tell her the rest, Vincent said softly. Before somebody else does. I looked directly at my father. What else? He rubbed both hands over his face slowly. Older suddenly. Smaller. 20 years ago, he began quietly. Your mother and I worked closely with the Moretti family on overseas investments. Vincent remained completely still near the altar. Your father was my mother's financial advisor, he added. She trusted him completely. My father nodded weakly. There was an investigation involving several companies at the time. Money disappeared. Powerful people started blaming each other. Did you steal from them? I asked. No, he answered too quickly. Vincent noticed too. That is not the important part, Vincent said calmly. The important part is what happened after. My father's breathing became uneven. I gave information to federal investigators. A ripple spread through the guests immediately. Even Father Graham looked shaken now. Dad? I whispered. I thought I was protecting our family, he said desperately. You do not understand the pressure we were under. Vincent finally spoke again, and somehow his quiet voice carried more disappointment than anger. My mother lost everything after that. The church lights reflected softly across the marble floor while nobody moved. Outside, distant thunder rolled through Manhattan. Rain had started again. Somehow that felt appropriate. She did not survive the scandal, Vincent continued, and your father spent the next 2 decades pretending he was innocent. My mother began crying silently in the front row. Daniel looked horrified, likely calculating how quickly this disaster could destroy his political career. But I could not stop looking at Vincent, not because of his power, because of the restraint in his face. Any other man standing there would have wanted humiliation, revenge, victory. Vincent looked like someone carrying grief too long to remember how to put it down. Then why help my family? I finally asked. He met my eyes instantly. Because of you. The answer came without hesitation. The church seemed to freeze again. Daniel laughed once under his breath in disbelief. You expect everyone to believe this is about kindness? Vincent ignored him. The night outside St. Jude Hospital, he said to me quietly. You treated me like I was still human. Something painful moved through his expression before disappearing almost immediately. Do you know how rare that becomes? My throat tightened unexpectedly, because I suddenly understood something terrible about powerful men. The world stopped seeing them as people long before they stopped acting like people. My father stood again shakily. Vincent, I never meant for Eveline to become involved. That is the problem, Vincent replied softly. You built her entire future around damage she never caused. Daniel stepped forward immediately. Eveline is marrying me because she loves me. The silence afterward was brutal. Nobody answered him. Not even me. Daniel slowly turned toward me, finally noticing the hesitation on my face. Eveline? He asked quietly. I opened my mouth but nothing came out, because for the first time since walking into the church that morning, I realized something unbearable. I had spent years preparing to marry the man my family needed, while standing only a few feet away from the man who had quietly protected me without asking for anything at all. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows while $30 million worth of flowers sat untouched around the altar. Nobody cared about the wedding anymore. Not after the truth entered the room wearing a black suit and tired eyes. Daniel loosened his jaw slowly like he was trying to regain control of a situation slipping through his fingers. Eveline, he said carefully, whatever history exists between our families has nothing to do with us. I turned toward him. Does it not? He hesitated. That hesitation answered enough. Vincent noticed too. You knew, he said quietly. Daniel straightened immediately. I knew there were financial arrangements. That is a polished way to describe debt. Daniel's eyes hardened. Politics and business survive on agreements. Vincent almost smiled at that. No, men like you survive on agreements. The tension between them felt sharp enough to cut through the church air. But what unsettled me most was how different they looked standing side by side. Daniel wore perfection like a tailored jacket. Every word measured. Every expression practiced. Vincent looked like someone too exhausted to pretend anymore. And somehow honesty made him more dangerous than power ever could. You are judging me, Daniel said toward me quietly now, for helping your family survive? Did you love me? I asked suddenly. The question landed harder than shouting would have. Daniel blinked once, caught off guard. Of course I do. But the answer came too late, too prepared, like a line memorized before cameras started rolling. Vincent looked away immediately after hearing it, almost respectfully, as though my heartbreak deserved privacy even inside a crowded church. That small gesture hurt more than anything else that morning. My father stood again slowly. Daniel agreed to marry Eveline because the alliance protected both families. The word alliance made my stomach twist. Not marriage. Alliance. Business language. Transaction language. I looked down at the wedding ring waiting beside the Bible near the altar. Suddenly it looked less like love and more like paperwork. You used me, I whispered. No, my father said quickly. We protected you. Vincent's expression changed instantly at those words. Not anger. Disbelief. You sold her future to clean up your past, he said quietly. Do not call that protection. Nobody responded because nobody could. The truth had become too visible now. Daniel stepped closer toward me, lowering his voice. Eveline, listen to me carefully. None of this changes the life we planned. I stared at him. You mean the life you planned? His face tightened. Outside, thunder rolled again above Manhattan. Father Graham slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes like a man questioning every life decision that led him to this exact church service. Vincent remained near the altar without moving. Calm, patient, but there was tension beneath his stillness now, like he was waiting for something invisible to break. There is one thing I still do not understand, I said softly while looking at him. If you hated my father this much, why stay away all these years? The entire room focused on Vincent again. He took a long breath before answering. Because revenge becomes complicated when innocence is standing in front of it. Silence settled heavily around us. I felt my heartbeat stumble against my ribs. He continued looking directly at me when he spoke again. The night you helped me outside St. Jude Hospital, you did not ask what I owned. You did not ask who feared me. You saw a stranger in pain and stopped walking. His voice lowered slightly. After that, hurting your family no longer felt simple. Daniel laughed quietly under his breath again, but this time bitterness replaced confidence. So this entire performance is because she was nice to you one night? Vincent finally turned toward him fully. No, he answered calmly. It is because she remained kind in a world that rewards people for becoming cold. The words hit me harder than they should have. Because nobody had ever defended my heart like it was something valuable before. My father suddenly looked toward Vincent with desperation filling his face. What do you want from us? Vincent's expression became unreadable again. Nothing. That is impossible. No, Vincent replied softly. It is unfamiliar. The church went silent all over again, because everyone there understood the same thing at the exact same moment. Vincent Moretti had entered the church with every reason to destroy our lives. But the longer he stood near me, the more he looked like a man fighting himself instead. People imagine life-changing decisions arrive with certainty. They do not. They arrive while your hands are shaking and your heart is trying to survive two truths at once. The church no longer felt like a wedding venue. It felt like a confession no one prepared for. Rain continued tapping softly against the stained glass windows while guests avoided eye contact with one another, terrified of becoming part of the story unfolding in front of them. Daniel stepped toward me again, lowering his voice carefully like we were the only two people left in the room. Eveline, he said, whatever emotions you are feeling right now, do not let this man manipulate them. Vincent remained silent near the altar. That silence mattered. He never interrupted me. Never pressured me. He simply waited. Manipulate, I repeated quietly. You mean like arranging a marriage to rescue political donors and family debt? Daniel's face hardened immediately. That is not fair. No, I whispered. What is unfair is discovering my future was negotiated like a business contract. My mother began crying again softly from the front pew. My father looked completely defeated now, like a man finally forced to stand inside the consequences he spent 20 years avoiding. But somehow I felt sorry for him too. That was the cruel thing about family. Even after betrayal, part of your heart still wanted to protect them. Vincent noticed the conflict on my face instantly. Of course he did. Men who survive by reading danger learn to recognize pain even faster. Eveline, he said quietly, you do not owe me anything. The words hit harder than promises ever could. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. You walk into her wedding, destroy her life in front of everyone, and now you want to sound honorable? Vincent finally looked toward him again. Calm, controlled. If I wanted to destroy her life, Councilman, I would have arrived earlier. The church fell silent all over again. Daniel opened his mouth to respond but stopped. Because deep down, everyone there knew Vincent was telling the truth. A man with his influence could have ruined my family years ago. Instead, he protected us quietly from the shadows. My chest tightened painfully. Why today? I asked him. His eyes met mine immediately. Because I saw the guest list yesterday. Confusion crossed my face. Vincent continued softly. I thought seeing your name beside his would not affect me. A long pause followed. I was wrong. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. The honesty in his voice felt almost dangerous because it carried no performance inside it. Just truth. Raw and restrained. Daniel stepped between us suddenly. This conversation is over. Vincent's expression never changed. That decision belongs to her. Something shifted inside me then. Small but permanent. My entire life, men had been making decisions around me while calling it love. My father, Daniel, business partners, family friends, everyone protecting me by controlling me. But Vincent stood there offering me the one thing nobody else had. Choice. I slowly placed the bouquet onto the altar beside the untouched wedding rings. The soft sound echoed through the church louder than thunder. My mother covered her mouth immediately. Daniel looked pale. Eveline, he whispered carefully, think about what you are doing. I looked at him for a long moment. That is exactly what I am finally doing. The words hurt him. I could see it. And despite everything, guilt twisted through me. Daniel was not evil. Ambitious, yes. Calculated, absolutely. But not cruel. We were simply two people building a future for the wrong reasons. Vincent remained completely still while watching me. Not hopeful. Not triumphant. Almost cautious. Like he still expected me to walk away from him at any second. I took a slow breath before turning toward my father. Did you know he loved her? I asked softly. My father looked confused. Who? His mother. The question hit Vincent unexpectedly too. His eyes shifted toward me with quiet surprise. My father lowered his head slowly. Yes, he admitted. I knew. Pain crossed Vincent's face before disappearing again behind discipline. Suddenly I understood everything. This was never only about money, or betrayal, or debt. It was about what happens when fear convinces good people to abandon loyalty. I looked back at Vincent one final time near the altar. And after everything my family did, I asked quietly, you still protected me? He answered without hesitation. You were never the one I blamed. Some endings do not sound like explosions. Sometimes they sound like a woman quietly stepping away from the life everyone expected her to choose. Nobody spoke after Vincent answered me. The rain outside softened into a steady rhythm against the church windows, while candlelight flickered across the marble floor. For the first time all morning, the room no longer felt tense. Felt exposed. Like every person inside it had accidentally revealed who they really were. I looked down at the wedding dress wrapped around me. Thousands of dollars in silk and lace. Months of planning. Smiling for photographers. Pretending certainty while ignoring the quiet voice inside me asking harder questions. I had spent so much time trying to become the version of myself other people needed that I forgot to ask whether I was happy. Slowly, I reached up and removed the engagement ring Daniel had placed on my hand earlier that morning before the ceremony began. The movement was small, but the sound of the ring touching the Bible near the altar echoed through the church like a final sentence. Daniel stared at it in silence. Hurt crossed his face instantly. Real hurt. Not political embarrassment. Not damaged pride. Just disappointment from a man realizing control and love were never the same thing. I did care about you, I told him softly. I still do. He swallowed hard before answering. But not enough. Tears filled my eyes unexpectedly. Not in the way a marriage deserves. Daniel looked away toward the stained glass windows, jaw tightening as he fought for composure. Then something surprising happened. He nodded once. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just tired. I think, he said quietly. Part of me knew that already. The honesty in his voice broke whatever resentment remained between us. Sometimes good people still choose the wrong future. My father remained seated in the front pew, staring at the floor like he could still somehow rewind 20 years of fear and mistakes. I walked toward him slowly. Dad. He looked up at me with red eyes. I am sorry, he whispered immediately. The words sounded fragile coming from him. Human. I know, I answered softly. And somehow I meant it, because forgiveness does not always arrive after justice. Sometimes it arrives after exhaustion. My mother wrapped both arms around him while crying quietly against his shoulder. Vincent watched the scene from several feet away without interrupting it. That mattered too. He understood grief enough not to invade it. Father Graham finally let out a slow breath beside the altar. "Well," he murmured softly, "this is certainly not how I expected today to go." A few nervous laughs escaped through the church for the first time all morning. Even Vincent almost smiled. Almost. Then the silence returned again, gentler this time. Vincent adjusted the cuff of his black suit slowly before looking toward the doors behind him. "You should all go home," he said quietly. "There is nothing left to fear here." One by one, guests began standing carefully from the pews. Conversations remained hushed. Eyes continued drifting toward Vincent with uncertainty. But something had changed. Earlier they looked at him like a threat. Now they looked at him like a man carrying sadness too heavy for one lifetime. I watched him turn toward the exit beneath the tall church doors. "Vincent." He stopped immediately at the sound of my voice. Slowly he looked back at me. The distance between us suddenly felt enormous despite only being a few feet apart. "You came here for answers," I said softly. "Did you find them?" He studied me for a long moment before answering. "Not the ones I expected." My heartbeat stumbled again. Outside, the rain had finally started fading above Manhattan. Sunlight pushed weakly through the stained glass, painting colors across the church floor between us. Vincent glanced down at the abandoned wedding ring beside the Bible, then back at me. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "you looked beautiful today." The sincerity in his voice hurt more than flattery ever could. He stepped closer one final time, carefully lifting the edge of my veil where it had fallen crooked against my shoulder during the chaos. His fingers barely touched the fabric before he let go again. Gentle, respectful, like he understood some things became sacred when handled carefully. "Take care of yourself, Eveline." Then Vincent Moretti walked out of the church alone. No bodyguards surrounding him. No threats. No revenge. Just a man disappearing quietly into the rain after choosing mercy over history. And standing there in the silence he left behind, I finally understood something nobody had ever taught me before. The most dangerous people are not the ones capable of destroying your life. They are the ones powerful enough to do it, and who choose not to.